Welcome back to Gravepath Stories. Tonight, I have 10 true terrifying, someone under the bed, horror stories for you. Before we begin, make sure you're subscribed, because once you step onto the grave path, you don't walk alone. I was on my knees with a pry bar wedged into the edge of a warped floorboard when I heard the soft scrape under the bed behind me. The kind of sound wood makes when something presses against it and then lets go. I froze with my weight still forward, heart beating too fast for the quiet room, telling myself it was the board settling or a nail shifting. I waited, counted a few breaths in my head, then leaned back and pulled the board free. Dust puffed up, dry and grey, and drifted across the floor toward the bed. I wiped my face with my sleeve, annoyed more than scared, and slid the board aside. That was when I noticed the handprint. It was clear as anything. A full palm pressed into the dust under the bed, fingers spread, the lines sharp like it had been made seconds ago. I stared at it, then at my own hands, coated in grit and old varnish. I hadn't been under the bed. I knew that. I hadn't even leaned that way. I laughed once, a short sound that didn't feel real, and told myself it had always been there. Old houses held onto marks like that. Someone before me. Some kid or renter long gone. Still, the dust around it looked untouched, smooth except for that one print. I leaned closer and saw another, smaller, just beside it, like someone had shifted their weight. I grabbed the flashlight from my toolbox and lay flat, shining the beam under the bed. The frame was metal, low, with a thin mattress sagging in the middle. Underneath, there was nothing but dust, a couple of lost socks, and the shallow crawl space that ended at the wall. No person, no animal, no reason for fresh handprints. I wiped my face again and told myself to stop being stupid. I was tired. I'd been fixing that place for weeks after work, trying to make it livable. My hands were shaking, though, and I noticed it when I pushed myself up. That night, after I cleaned up, I tried to sleep. I kept thinking about the handprints, about how clear they were. Every creak of the house felt louder. When I finally drifted off, I woke with a start to the sound of something bumping softly against the bed frame. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, a dull tap, then nothing. I lay there until my muscles ached, then reached down and flicked on the lamp. The room looked the same as always. I told myself it was the heat pipes or the floor settling. I turned the lamp off and forced my eyes closed. The next morning, my hammer was gone. I noticed when I went to grab it from the toolbox. I stood there staring at the empty space where it should have been, feeling foolishly annoyed. I searched the room, the kitchen, even the bathroom, thinking I must have set it down somewhere stupid. I checked under the bed last, more out of habit than fear. The hammer lay there, placed neatly parallel to the wall, handle facing out. The dust around it was disturbed, dragged in lines like fingers had pulled it into place. I sat back on my heels and laughed again, louder this time, because the alternative was to admit I was scared. Someone had been in my room. Someone had been under my bed. I stood up and checked the locks, the windows. Everything was secure. No signs of forced entry. I called the landlord, asked if anyone else had a key. He told me no, just him, and he hadn't been by. I didn't tell him about the handprints. I didn't want to sound crazy. That night, I set a chair against the door and placed a glass on the handle some trick I'd heard about. I lay awake listening to my own breathing, to the house. At some point, I felt the bed shift, just slightly, like someone had put a hand on the frame. I clenched my jaw and stared at the wall, refusing to look. The glass didn't fall. The door didn't open. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. Over the next few days, small things kept disappearing. A tape measure, always turning up under the bed, arranged carefully, like someone was organizing my tools. Each time, the dust showed fresh marks, more handprints, sometimes smeared, sometimes pressed hard. I stopped laughing. I stopped sleeping. I started keeping the light on, started jumping at every sound. I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe someone had access through the crawl space. Maybe a vagrant had found a way in. I pulled the mattress off the bed and flipped the frame, checking every bolt. Nothing. I pried up more floorboards, searching for hidden gaps. The space beneath was shallow, barely enough to fit an arm. There was nowhere for a person to hide. Still, the handprints kept appearing. One afternoon, I came home early and found new ones, larger, pressed deeper into the dust, like someone heavier had leaned there. I felt sick, the kind of cold nausea that starts in your gut. I called the police. I showed them the prints, the missing tools. They listened politely, shined their flashlights, shrugged. No signs of forced entry, they said. Maybe I was misplacing things. Maybe I was stressed. One of them suggested I get more sleep. When they left, the house felt emptier and more hostile than before. That night, I decided to confront whatever it was. I lay on the floor with the flashlight, staring into the darkness under the bed. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. Just when I started to relax, the dust shifted. A hand emerged, pale and dirty, fingers splayed, pressing into the floor. Another followed. I screamed, scrambling back, slamming into the wall. The hands withdrew fast, too fast, disappearing into the shallow space like they'd never been there. I didn't sleep after that. I sat in the kitchen until morning, shaking, trying to understand what I'd seen. It hadn't made sense. There was no room, no body, just hands. When the sun came up, I packed a bag. I wasn't going to stay another night. As I grabbed my last things from the bedroom, I noticed something I'd missed before. The floor under the bed was lower than the rest, worn down, smoothed by years of pressure, by hands. I tore up the floorboards with a kind of frantic energy, not caring about the damage. Underneath, I found an old access panel, sealed and painted over. It took effort to pry it open. Beneath was a narrow tunnel, barely high enough to crawl, leading deeper into the house. The walls were smooth, worn by touch. At the end, there was a small chamber, no bigger than a closet. Inside, I found personal things, clothes, a mattress on the floor, and a body, long dead, curled against the wall. The police came back, this time with a different tone. They told me the house had been used decades ago by a man who hid beneath floors, spying, stealing. He'd died down there, trapped. The tunnels had been sealed, but not well enough. They said animals could have disturbed things, caused the marks. I didn't argue. I moved out that day. Sometimes, when I think about it, I remember the way the hand pressed into the dust, deliberate, careful, not random, like it was still organizing, still reaching out, long after the rest of it was gone. I was already halfway down the hall when my son called out that I was doing it wrong again. His voice thin and urgent in the way it only got when he was trying not to cry. I stopped with my hand on the light switch and asked him what rule I had broken this time. And he said I had turned my back to the bed before checking underneath. He said the rule was that I had to stay facing it the whole time, because if I didn't, whoever was under there would know I wasn't watching. I remember feeling that tired flash of irritation parents get at the end of a long day, the instinct to say enough, go to sleep. But something in how carefully he said it made me walk back into the room instead. He was sitting up against the headboard, knees pulled tight to his chest, eyes locked on the dark gap beneath the bed frame. I crouched down and lifted the edge of the duvet, expecting to see the usual clutter of forgotten toys and dust. There was nothing there. Clean carpet, the bed slats, the wall. I told him it was clear and reached to tuck him in, and that's when he grabbed my wrist hard enough to hurt and whispered that I had to listen first. He told me to put my ear close, not all the way down, just close enough to hear if the whispering was happening. Against my better judgment, I did it. I heard nothing but my own breathing and the distant hum of the house. I told him it was quiet, and he shook his head and said it only talked when I was gone. That was the first night of the rules, though I didn't know it yet. Over the next week, they multiplied. I had to check under the bed 3 times, never twice. I had to leave the hallway light on, but turn his lamp off. I had to sit on the edge of the mattress for exactly as long as it took him to count to 20 in his head, because if I left sooner, the voice would get closer. When I asked him what the voice said, he hesitated, then told me it was just reminders. Little things. Don't hang your feet off the bed. Don't sleep on your stomach. Don't move the pillows away from the wall. Each rule came with a reason, and the reasons were always about safety, about preventing something bad from happening. I told myself it was an active imagination, that he'd overheard something at school or picked it up from a show. Rotorua isn't exactly free of stories that stick in your head if you're a kid. Still, the specificity of it bothered me. He wasn't describing monsters or anything obviously fantastical. He talked about someone small enough to fit under the bed, someone who knew how the house worked. One night, when I pressed him, he said the voice told him about the pipes, about how sound traveled through them, and about a door somewhere that wasn't meant to be used anymore. When I asked where he'd heard about pipes and doors, he shrugged and said the voice explained it very clearly. I started staying longer after lights out, sitting in the hallway and listening. I never heard whispering, but I did notice other things. Soft, irregular sounds at night that I'd always assumed were the house settling. A faint dragging noise that stopped when I shifted in my chair. Once, very late, a gentle thump from his room, like someone had knocked on the floor from underneath. I went in immediately, heart racing, and found him wide awake, staring down. He told me it had just reminded him to keep his arms close to his body while he slept. The first real argument we had about it was when I tried to break the rules on purpose. I'd read enough parenting advice to think that gently challenging the fear might help. That night, after the usual routine, I stood up before he finished counting. He panicked, scrambling to grab me, shouting that I was going to make it angry. I stayed firm. Told him there was nothing there, that he was safe. The moment I stepped into the hall, he screamed. Not a scared yelp, but a full, raw scream that made my chest tighten. I ran back in and found him pressed flat against the headboard, pointing under the bed. He said it had told him I didn't care if he got hurt. It took an hour to calm him down. I apologized, even though I didn't fully understand what I was apologizing for, and promised to follow the rules again. After he finally fell asleep, I stayed on the floor beside his bed, staring into the darkness underneath. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, that I'd crossed an invisible line. When I eventually checked my watch and saw how late it was, I realized I hadn't heard a single sound from under there the entire time I'd been watching. The next morning, I noticed the marks. At first, I thought it was dirt tracked in from outside, a faint smudge on the carpet near the wall. But when I looked closer, I saw it was a series of shallow impressions, like fingers pressed hard into the fibers and dragged. They led from the center of the room to the space beneath the bed. I called his name, trying to keep my voice steady, and asked him if he'd been playing under there. He shook his head and said the rules, said he wasn't allowed to look anymore. He said it didn't like being seen. I pulled the bed away from the wall, ignoring his protests, and got down on my hands and knees. The marks continued underneath, deeper there, clearer. Not fingerprints exactly, but long, narrow indentations that suggested someone pulling themselves forward. The space under the bed ended at the wall, and for a moment I felt a wave of relief. Then I noticed the vent cover, low and wide, painted the same color as the skirting board. I'd lived in the house for years without paying it much attention. It was loose. I could see a dark gap behind it, just big enough for a small person to squeeze through. I told my son to go to the kitchen and put his hands over his ears. He didn't argue. He just looked at me with an expression that felt far too old for his face, and said it was going to be upset that I was breaking the rules again. I unscrewed the vent cover with shaking hands. Behind it was a narrow duct, dusty and scuffed. The scuffs weren't random. They followed the same pattern as the marks on the carpet, leading away from the room, deeper into the house. I didn't call the police right away. I wish I could say I did, that I acted decisively, but the truth is I stood there for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Maintenance ducts, crawl spaces. Someone living inside the walls sounded impossible, like something out of a story I would have dismissed. But the evidence was right there, and it was leading away from my child's bed. When I finally did call, my voice shook so badly I had to repeat myself. They arrived faster than I expected. The officers were careful, methodical. They followed the duct, mapping where it ran. It connected to an old service corridor that had been sealed years ago during renovations, a narrow passage that ran behind several walls. Inside, they found bedding, food wrappers, a torch. Someone had been there recently, very recently. One officer came back out and asked me, gently, if my son had mentioned hearing instructions. When I said yes, he nodded in a way that made my stomach drop. He said they'd seen this before. People hiding in buildings, watching learning routines. He didn't finish the sentence. They never found the person. There were signs of an exit farther down the corridor, another loose panel leading out to a different part of the house. Then nothing. My son slept in my room for weeks afterward. The rules faded slowly. He stopped insisting on them, stopped listening for whispers. One night, months later, he asked me if I thought it was still angry. I told him no, that it was gone, that he was safe. I believed it then. We moved not long after, though I never told him that was why. Sometimes, when I tuck him in now, he asks me to stay until he counts to 20, just out of habit. I do it without complaint. I face the bed the whole time. Even now, I don't turn my back until I'm out of the room. I'm crouched beside the bed with my hands on the mattress frame when I hear it shift underneath me. Not loud, not sudden, just enough to let me know something down there has adjusted its weight in response to mine. My stomach tightens instantly, the way it does when you miss a step on stairs, and I freeze without meaning to. I tell myself it's the house settling, even though that explanation feels thin and lazy, and I stay still long enough that my knees start to ache. When nothing else happens, I force myself upright, palms damp, heart thudding hard enough to feel in my throat. I had only moved the bed to retrieve my phone charger, which had slipped behind the frame earlier that night. The basement room is small enough that moving furniture is always awkward, and the bed scrapes the concrete floor no matter how careful I am. I remember thinking, as I pulled the frame back into place, that the sound underneath didn't match the scrape. It sounded more like fabric shifting, or a shoe dragging lightly across grit. I laughed under my breath then, because laughing felt easier than standing there in silence. I'm in Banff for seasonal work, housekeeping at one of the lodges that swells with tourists every winter. The pay isn't great, but housing is included, and that matters more than anything in a town where rent can eat an entire paycheck. The house I'm staying in is an old split level owned by a couple who rent rooms to staff. 2 rooms upstairs, 2 in the basement. Mine is the smallest. They called it rental number 3 on the lease, like a storage unit, which should have bothered me more than it did. The first night I slept there, I noticed the bed frame sat unusually high, leaving a deeper gap beneath than I was used to. I remember glancing under it with my phone light, seeing nothing but dust and a few stray spiders, and shrugging it off. Basements always feel wrong at first. You get used to them, or you don't. And I needed the room, so I decided I would. The movement doesn't happen again that night, but I don't sleep well. Every time I drift off, I feel like I'm being watched from floor level. It's a stupid thought, and I tell myself that, but it keeps coming back. By morning, I've convinced myself I imagined the sound entirely. Over the next week, the noises return, never loud, never clear enough to point to. A faint rustle when I turn over. A soft knock against the bed frame when I sit down too hard. Once, something brushes the underside of the mattress, like knuckles testing its firmness. Each time, I stop breathing until the silence returns. Each time, I tell myself there has to be a normal explanation. I ask the guy in the room next to mine, Mark, if he's heard anything strange in the basement. He laughs and says the pipes are old and the floors creak, then adds that at least the last tenant in my room finally moved out. When I ask what he means, he shrugs and says the guy just vanished halfway through the season. left clothes behind, never came back for them. Management assumed he skipped town. That night, I check under the bed again, more thoroughly. I get down on my hands and knees, phone light sweeping the concrete. I notice marks I hadn't seen before, faint scuffs in the dust that look like something has been dragged back and forth. They don't lead anywhere obvious. They just circle the center, like pacing. I sit back on my heels, trying to slow my breathing. I tell myself it could be mice. Even though I know mice don't make marks like that, I remind myself that fear has a way of filling in gaps with whatever scares you most. Still, I push a storage bin under the bed, then another, until there's barely room left for anything to move. For 2 nights after that, everything is quiet. I start to relax, embarrassed by how wound up I let myself get. On the 3rd night, I wake to pressure on the mattress, right near my calves. It's subtle, but unmistakable, like someone resting a forearm there. I lie perfectly still, every muscle locked, counting my breaths. The pressure remains for several seconds, then eases away. I don't sleep again after that. I sit up with the light on until morning, staring at the bed like it might blink. When I tell the landlord, she looks uncomfortable but not surprised. She says the previous tenant complained about noises too, but maintenance never found anything. She suggests I move rooms if one opens up. There's no apology in her voice, just resignation. I ask her if she knows what happened to the guy who vanished. She tells me he was odd, kept to himself and paid cash. That's all she knows. That night, I put my phone on the floor with the camera recording, angled under the bed. I don't expect much, but I need proof, even if it's only for myself. I lie there pretending to sleep, listening to my own heartbeat. Around what feels like 2 in the morning, I hear it again, clearer this time. A slow inhale, a slow exhale, right beneath me. I don't move. I don't breathe. The sound continues, steady and patient. Something presses up against the mattress, enough that I feel the fabric stretch. I want to scream, but my body refuses. After a minute that feels endless, the breathing stops. The pressure fades. In the morning, I check the recording. At first, there's nothing. Then, halfway through, the camera shifts slightly, as if nudged. A shadow passes across the lens, blocking the light. I watch it over and over, my hands shaking. The timestamp jumps forward several minutes I don't remember. I pack my bag that afternoon. I don't bother with subtlety. Clothes, toiletries, everything goes in. When I pull the bed away from the wall to retrieve my shoes, I see the edge of something under there that wasn't there before. Fabric. Dark, folded carefully. I don't touch it. I call the police instead. They arrive skeptical, but that changes when they look under the bed. The space beneath is deeper than it should be. A false panel slides back to reveal a narrow crawl space extending beneath the rest of the basement. Inside are blankets, empty food containers, and a stack of folded clothes that aren't mine. One of the officers goes very still when he finds a wallet tucked against the wall. The name inside matches the lease from the previous season. They find more than that. Enough to explain the smell I'd started to notice, the one I thought was just damp concrete. Enough that they ask me to wait outside while they call for more support. I sit on the front steps shaking, staring at the mountains in the distance and feeling utterly detached from them. Later, an officer tells me the man had been living in the crawl space after losing his job, hiding during the day, moving at night. He'd been too afraid to leave, convinced someone was watching him. He died down there, alone, sometime before I moved in. The noises I heard were structural shifts, they say, or my imagination feeding on fear. I don't argue. I don't tell them about the breathing, or the pressure, or the camera moving on its own. I don't think they'd believe me, and part of me doesn't want them to. I leave Banff the next day. I don't finish the season. Even now, when I lie in bed, I'm careful about where I put my feet. I don't let anything hang over the edge. And sometimes, just before I fall asleep, I swear I can feel someone listening from below, waiting for me to move. I was on my knees pushing a blue plastic car under my bed when it hit something that wasn't dust or a wall, and the sound it made stopped me cold. A dull knock like it had bumped another toy I didn't remember owning. I lay flat on my stomach and reached under, my arm sliding over grit and old crumbs, my fingers brushing something round and rubbery. I pulled my hand back fast, heart racing, and told myself it was just another toy I had forgotten, because forgetting things felt safer than wondering who had put it there. I was 8 then, living with my mother in a small apartment where my room was the only place that felt like it belonged to me. I spent a lot of time on the floor, lining up cars, rolling balls, making up quiet games that didn't need much space. That afternoon I rolled the blue car under the bed again, harder this time, listening as it rattled farther than before. I waited, expecting it to roll back or hit the wall. Nothing happened. I felt that tight feeling in my chest again, the one that came when something didn't follow the rules I understood. I slid my head down and peered into the dark under the bed. My eyes adjusted enough to see shapes, legs of the frame, dust bunnies like little animals. Near the middle I saw a red ball scuffed and grey with dirt. It wasn't mine. I didn't own a red ball. I reached for it, my fingers just touching the rubber, and then it rolled away from me, deeper under the bed, as if nudged. I pulled back so fast I hit my head on the bed frame and started crying, more from shock than pain. I scrambled up and ran into the kitchen, where my mother was washing dishes. I told her there was something under my bed. She sighed the way adults do when they think you're being dramatic, dried her hands, and followed me back. She knelt and looked under the bed, her face calm, her voice steady as she told me there was nothing there but dust and my toys. She pulled out the blue car I had rolled under and handed it to me. The red ball was gone. I pointed and tried to explain, but the words tangled up. She kissed my head and told me to stop worrying, that old buildings made noises and children imagined things. I wanted to believe her because she sounded so sure. That night I lay in bed listening to the normal sounds of the apartment, pipes, distant footsteps, things I had heard all my life. I rolled my green dinosaur off the bed by accident. It bounced once and came to rest under the frame. I stared at the edge of the bed, waiting. A long moment passed. Then something rolled back out, tapping softly against the leg of the bed. It wasn't the dinosaur. It was a small yellow truck, its paint scratched down to dull plastic, its wheels clogged with black dirt. I knew it wasn't mine. I sat up, my throat tight, and whispered for my mother. She came, tired and annoyed, and picked up the truck. She turned it over in her hands, frowning, then said, Maybe it belonged to the previous tenants and had been under the bed the whole time. She tossed it into my toy box and told me to sleep. I didn't sleep much. Every time I shifted, every time the bed creaked, I imagined something moving beneath me. In the morning, I checked the toy box. The yellow truck was gone. In its place was my green dinosaur. Its tail chewed and its feet blackened as if it had been dragged through soil. I stopped rolling toys under the bed after that, but toys still appeared. A doll missing an eye, a metal car bent and rusted. They always showed up near the bed, always dirty, always not mine. My own toys would vanish and come back altered, scratched, smelling faintly of damp earth. I tried to clean them, but the dirt seemed ground in, like it had been there a long time. I started sleeping with my feet tucked tight, blankets wrapped around me, so nothing could touch my ankles. I listened for sounds under the bed, soft shuffling, the scrape of plastic on wood. When I told my mother, she took me to a doctor who said I was anxious, imaginative. I learned to keep quiet. One afternoon I was home alone, sitting on the floor drawing, when I heard a slow rolling sound. Something emerged from under the bed, stopping just short of the light. It was my blue car, the first one, but its windows were cracked and its underside packed with dirt. Behind it, just visible, was a small hand, pale and grimy, fingers curled around another toy. I didn't scream. I couldn't. I backed away, heart pounding so hard I felt sick. The hand withdrew, the toys rolling back into darkness. When my mother came home, I told her everything. This time she listened. She got down on the floor, pulled the mattress off, and we dragged the bed away. Underneath was a loose panel in the floor, edges worn smooth. When she lifted it, a smell rose up, cold and rotten. There was a narrow space beneath, a crawl area filled with dirt and trash. And there were toys, dozens of them, all kinds, all ruined. In the corner, wrapped in old fabric, were small bones. The police came. Social workers. I was sent to stay with my aunt. Later they told us a child had once lived there, years before, hidden by a parent, never allowed out. When the parent left, the child stayed, surviving, reaching out for toys, for anything. They said the child was gone now. We moved. I grew up. I still think about the way my toys came back to me, changed, as if touched by someone who wanted to play, who wanted to be seen. Sometimes I wake up remembering the sound of plastic rolling on wood, and I tuck my feet in close, just in case. I was kneeling on the spare room floor, with my ear pressed to the carpet, when the whisper started again, close enough that I felt breath stir the fibers under my cheek, and my first thought was that I had finally pushed myself into imagining things. I pulled back and held still, palms flat on the floor, heart hammering, listening. The house was supposed to be empty except for me, and I was only there to water plants and make sure nothing broke while the owners were away. But the sound was unmistakable, a low murmur coming from directly beneath the guest bed. I stood up too fast and smacked my knee on the bed frame, swearing out loud to steady myself. The whisper stopped immediately, as if whoever had been speaking knew I was upright now. I told myself it was plumbing, air in the pipes, some harmless explanation I could laugh about later, but I did not move away. I bent and lifted the edge of the bedspread, staring into the narrow darkness under the mattress. Nothing. Just shadows, dust, and the storage boxes the family had left there. stacked neatly like they had not been touched in years. I backed away and sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing my knee, trying to slow my breathing. House sitting was supposed to be easy money, a quiet week in a place that was not mine, with no responsibilities beyond feeding the cat and locking the doors at night. I had taken the job because I needed the cash and because Bruges had always felt calm to me. The kind of city where things stayed where they belonged. That thought felt thin now. I stayed seated for several minutes, waiting for the whisper to come back, but the room stayed quiet. I laughed, a short nervous sound, and told myself I was overtired. I had been sleeping badly in someone else's bed, listening to unfamiliar creaks, waking at every noise. Anyone would get jumpy. Still, I dragged one of the boxes out from under the bed with my foot. It was lighter than I expected, filled with old magazines and folded linens. I slid the others out one by one, checking behind them. There was no one there, no sign of disturbance. Just a faint smell of dust and something else, something stale that made my nose wrinkle. I pushed everything back, a little harder than necessary, and stood up. The whisper did not return, and eventually I convinced myself I had imagined it. I finished my chores, locked up the house, and left for the evening, glad to be out in the open air again. That night, lying in the main bedroom, I woke to the same sound. It was clearer this time, close enough that I could tell it was not plumbing or wind. It was a voice, or maybe two voices, overlapping softly, like someone muttering to themselves. The sound seemed to come from below me, not from the hall or another room, but from the floor itself. I sat up, heart pounding, and held my breath. The whisper continued, low and steady, not loud enough to make out words, but deliberate, like someone reading or reciting something under their breath. I swung my legs out of bed and stood there in the dark, every sense stretched tight. The sound shifted, growing quieter, then stopped altogether. I waited, counting my breaths, then crossed the room and turned on the light. Silence. I slept badly after that, waking at every small noise, checking the floor, the walls, the door. In the morning, with daylight pouring in, the house looked normal again. I made coffee, fed the cat, and tried to shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told myself I would check the spare room more thoroughly that day, just to put my mind at ease. I started with the obvious things, opening closets, checking behind furniture, looking for any sign that someone had been in places they should not be. Everything looked exactly as it should. No missing items, no disturbed dust, no open windows. When I got to the spare room, I hesitated before kneeling down again. The whisper did not come back right away. I lay flat on my stomach and listened, feeling foolish. The carpet pressed into my ribs, and I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Just when I was about to give up, the sound started again. Faint but unmistakable. This time I heard words. I could not make them out clearly, but the cadence was wrong for any normal household noise. It sounded like someone speaking softly to avoid being heard, stopping and starting, as if listening for a response. I pressed my ear closer to the floor, then froze. The whisper responded to the movement. It shifted, paused, then resumed, closer to where my head was now, like someone on the other side of a thin barrier, aware of me. I scrambled backward and stood up, my skin crawling. There was no way I was imagining this now. I grabbed my phone and called the homeowner, trying to keep my voice steady as I explained what I was hearing. He laughed gently and told me the house was old, that sounds carried strangely between floors, that I should not worry. He said there was no basement under the spare room, just a crawl space between levels, nothing anyone could get into. When I pressed him, he admitted the space existed, but insisted it was sealed and inaccessible. After the call, I stood in the spare room, staring at the bed. The whisper had stopped again, as if it knew I was talking about it. That was when I noticed the scratch marks. They were faint, almost hidden by the carpet's pattern, but once I saw them, I could not unsee them. Thin lines, worn into the fibers, leading from beneath the bed toward the wall. They looked like something had been dragged back and forth there, over and over. I knelt and ran my fingers over them. The carpet felt rougher along those lines, flattened by repeated contact. My mouth went dry. I pulled the bed away from the wall, revealing a narrow gap I had not noticed before. The skirting board along that wall was loose, not properly attached. I pressed on it, and it shifted slightly under my fingers. The whisper came back immediately, louder now, urgent. I stumbled away and nearly fell over the bed frame. My heart was racing so hard I felt dizzy. I stood there, staring at the wall, at the place where the sound was coming from, knowing I was not alone in that house after all. I did not call the homeowner again. I did not call the police yet. I wanted to understand what was happening, to make sense of it before I did anything else. That impulse, to know before acting, is something I still regret. I fetched a screwdriver from the kitchen and went back to the spare room, every step heavy with dread. The whisper continued, steady now, no longer stopping when I moved. It sounded closer, as if whatever was speaking knew I was coming. My hands shook as I pried the skirting board away from the wall. It came loose with a soft crack, revealing a narrow opening into darkness. A smell rolled out, stale and human, like unwashed clothes and old food. I shone my phone's light into the gap. There was a space between the floors, just as the homeowner had said, but it was not empty. I could see a narrow platform of boards, insulation pushed aside, and beyond that, the curve of the ceiling below. And there, tucked into that space, was evidence of someone living there. Blankets, bottles, food wrappers, a pillow, worn flat. The whisper stopped. I stood there, frozen, light shaking in my hand, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone had been living in the space between the floors of this house, close enough to hear me move, to listen to me sleep. A face appeared in the beam of my light. I screamed and stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. The man in the space flinched too, pressing himself against the boards, eyes wide. He looked thin, filthy, his hair matted. He raised a hand, palm out, as if to calm me. "Please," he whispered, "do not call." I backed into the opposite wall, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. My mind raced through everything that could happen next, every story I had ever heard. He stayed where he was, half hidden, not trying to climb out. "I was not hurting anyone," he said, still whispering. "I just needed somewhere." I did not respond. I could not. My throat felt closed. He told me he had been there for months, slipping in and out when the house was empty, living between the floors because no one ever checked there. He said he listened to people to know when it was safe to move. The whispering, he explained, was how he kept himself calm. I felt sick. I told him to stay where he was and backed out of the room, never taking my eyes off the opening until I was in the hall. Then I ran. I grabbed my jacket, my keys, and left the house, slamming the door behind me. Outside, my hands shook so badly I dropped my phone twice before I managed to call the police. They came quickly, more quickly than I expected, and I waited on the street, wrapped in my jacket, watching them go inside. When they brought him out, he did not look at me. He kept his head down, hands cuffed behind his back, murmuring to himself. The officers told me later that he had been using the house as a refuge, moving through connected crawl spaces, staying hidden. He had chosen that house because the spare room was rarely used, because no one noticed the sounds. I gave my statement and went home. I did not return to the house after that. The homeowners handled the rest. For a long time afterward, I could not sleep in silence. Any small noise under my bed made my skin crawl. I checked beneath it every night, even in my own apartment, even years later. What stays with me most is not fear, but the certainty of how close he was, how easily he could hear me breathe, how long he listened without me knowing. The house had not been haunted. It had been occupied in a way no one thought to look for. And every time I lie down in a quiet room, I remember the sound of that whisper, answering my movements, and I know how thin the space is between feeling safe and realizing you never were. I was already gripping the cot rails when the sound started again, a dull dragging scrape directly beneath my back, close enough that I felt it vibrate through the metal frame into my spine. I froze mid-breath, staring at the ceiling tiles while my heart kicked hard against my ribs. The nurse had just left. I knew that because the door latch was still settling, that faint click echoing down the corridor. I whispered hello, then immediately felt stupid for doing it, but the noise stopped as soon as I spoke, like something listening. I shifted my weight carefully, testing whether the cot would creak. It was bolted down. I remembered that clearly. They had brought it in that afternoon because the ward was full, drilled the feet straight into the floor while apologizing for the inconvenience. No wheels, no space underneath big enough for anything human. That knowledge should have calmed me. Instead, it made the silence heavier. I lay there counting my breaths, trying to convince myself the sound had been pipes, or air pressure, or my imagination spiraling because I was exhausted and in pain. Then something brushed the underside of the mattress, not hard, just enough to make the fabric whisper. I felt it through my shoulder blades and bit the inside of my cheek to keep from gasping. I was in for observation after collapsing at work. Nothing dramatic, just dizziness and a blackout that scared my supervisor enough to call an ambulance. They told me overnight, maybe 2 tests in the morning routine. I believed them until that cot scraped again, slow and deliberate, as if whatever was below it was repositioning itself. I slid my hand off the rail and reached down, fingers shaking, touching the cold metal edge. The space beneath was dark, but I could feel air moving, warm against my knuckles. I pulled my hand back fast and pressed it to my chest, trying to slow my breathing before anyone heard me panic. I called for the nurse. My voice came out thin. No answer. The corridor beyond my curtain sounded distant, muffled, like the ward had suddenly been padded. I called again, louder this time, and heard a faint reply from far away, a woman's voice saying, "Just a moment." The scraping stopped. The warmth faded. I stared at the gap between the mattress and the floor until my eyes burned, waiting for something to happen, for anything to prove I was not losing my grip. When the nurse finally came, I blurted everything out at once, the sounds, the movement, the air. She crouched, peered under the cot, knocked her knuckles against the floor, and smiled in a way that made me feel embarrassed and small. "Old building," she said. "Transfers used to run beneath this wing. Decommissioned years ago. Sometimes things settle." She asked if I wanted something to help me sleep. I nodded because arguing felt impossible. She checked the bolts, solid, unmoving, and left me with a pill and a paper cup of water. I waited until she was gone before swallowing it. The idea of drifting off while something moved beneath me made my stomach twist. I stayed awake longer than the medication probably wanted me to, listening hard. For a while, nothing happened. My muscles began to unclench, and I hated how relieved I felt, how quickly my brain was willing to forgive and forget. Then the tapping started. Not scraping this time. Tapping, irregular, like knuckles testing a surface. 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. I counted without meaning to. The pattern repeated. I pressed the call button and held it down until my thumb ached. The tapping stopped. Footsteps approached. I let go of the button and laughed too loudly, already apologizing. Another nurse this time, older, tired eyes. I told her again. She did not smile. She listened, then asked exactly where I had heard it. When I pointed, her mouth tightened. She said she would check something and told me not to worry. That last part sounded automatic. I watched her pull the curtain back and speak quietly with someone in the corridor. A man in maintenance clothes appeared, carrying a flashlight and a ring of keys. They crouched together near my bed, whispering. The man shone the light under the cot, sweeping it back and forth. Dust motes danced. Nothing else moved. He stood and said it was probably the tunnel settling, same as the other nurse. His voice wavered on tunnel, like it was a word he did not enjoy saying. I asked what kind of tunnel. He hesitated, then said patient transfer, old, sealed, not used anymore, safe. Always safe. After they left, the tapping did not return, but something else did. A low murmur, too soft to be words, rising and falling like someone whispering into fabric. It came from directly beneath my head. I pressed my ear into the pillow, horrified to realize it made the sound clearer. I could hear breath. Slow, controlled. I slid down the cot until my feet touched the floor and sat there, hugging my knees, shaking. I did not call for help. I did not know why. Maybe I was afraid they would tell me again that nothing was there. Maybe I already knew something was. When the morning shift arrived, I demanded a different bed. The charge nurse argued about availability until she saw my face. She sighed and said fine. But first they needed to move the cot to bring in another patient. 2 orderlies came, tools in hand, and began unbolting it from the floor. The first bolt came free easily. The second resisted, then loosened with a sharp crack that made us all jump. As they lifted the cot, a wave of warm, stale air rolled out from beneath it, carrying a smell like old cloth and antiseptic. One of the orderlies swore softly. There was a hatch in the floor, metal, flush with the tile, edges hidden by grime. It had been directly under my shoulders. The maintenance man from the night shift appeared again, eyes wide, and told everyone to stop. He knelt and wiped the hatch clean with his sleeve, revealing a faded warning symbol and a serial number I did not recognize. Security came, then administration. They moved me to another room without explanation. I watched from the doorway as they pried the hatch open. I did not see what was inside. I only heard the sound that came out, a thin, startled inhale, followed by shouting. They told me later, in careful, rehearsed language. The tunnel had been sealed but not properly closed. Someone had been living down there, moving between wards, through forgotten access points, hiding beneath temporary beds where the noise of the hospital covered their presence. A former patient, records lost during renovations, surviving in the margins. I asked how long. The doctor avoided my eyes. Long enough, she said. I was discharged that afternoon. I did not argue. I went home and slept on the floor for a week. Even now, when I lie in bed, I listen for breathing that is not mine, and I never let the space beneath me go unchecked. I was already half under the bed with my arm stretched out when I heard the sound again, a soft, dragging noise, like fabric brushing wood, and I froze with my cheek pressed to the floor, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might throw up. I whispered out loud, "Stop," without even knowing who I was talking to, then pulled my arm back and rolled onto my side, staring at the dark gap beneath the frame. I had been telling myself for 3 nights that it was nothing, that old apartments make noise, that pipes shift, that I was overtired from editing videos until early morning, but that sound had weight to it. It wasn't random. It moved, paused, then moved again, like something adjusting itself. I sat up on the mattress, legs crossed, listening. My phone was in my hand before I realized I'd grabbed it, the screen lighting my knees. I checked the time, then locked it again, annoyed at myself for even checking. I didn't want to turn on the overhead light. I didn't know why, but something about flooding the room with light felt like admitting fear. I leaned down and knocked on the floor once, hard, my knuckles stinging. "Hello," I said, trying to sound annoyed instead of scared. Nothing answered. But a few seconds later the dragging noise came back, closer to the edge of the bed. That was the moment I decided to set up the camera. Not as a joke. Not for content, and not because I thought I'd catch a ghost or some viral nonsense. I did it because I needed proof for myself. I needed something concrete, something I could look at and say, "Yes, that's real," or "No, you're losing it." I pulled my small action camera from the drawer, the one I used for low-angle shots, and mounted it on a flat base, so it sat just above floor level. I slid it under the bed with the lens angled toward the center, hit record, and whispered, "Just stay on," like it could hear me. I didn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, every nerve awake, listening to the smallest shifts in sound. At some point I did hear movement again, heavier this time, like a knee or elbow pressing against the floor, followed by a slow, controlled exhale. I remember thinking, very calmly, that breathing has rhythm, and that rhythm means intention. My mouth went dry. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just lay there and waited for morning. When the light finally crept in through the blinds, I sat up so fast I felt dizzy. I slid off the bed, dropped to my knees, and pulled the camera out. My hands were shaking so badly, I fumbled the buttons twice before stopping the recording. I didn't watch it right away. I made coffee. I sat at the table, and stared at the mug until it went cold. Then I plugged the camera into my laptop and watched. At first there was nothing. Dust, the underside of the bed frame, a sock I hadn't realized had rolled under there. Then, about an hour in, the image shifted slightly, as if the camera itself had been nudged. I leaned closer to the screen. A shape entered the frame, slow and deliberate. It was a shoulder, then part of a head, hair flattened and greasy, skin pale against the dark floor. The person moved with practiced care, staying low, their face always angled away from the lens. At one point a hand reached out, fingers splayed, and rested on the floor for several seconds before pulling back. I slammed the laptop shut and stood up, pacing. My apartment suddenly felt too small, like every wall was leaning inward. I replayed the footage twice more, forcing myself to watch the whole thing. The person stayed under there for over 2 hours. They shifted, adjusted, scratched their arm. At one point they reached up and touched the underside of the mattress, right beneath where my ribs had been. I went to the police that afternoon. I brought the camera, the laptop, everything. I remember sitting across from the desk, my knee bouncing, explaining slowly, clearly, like I was reading instructions. The officer watched part of the footage, then paused it and leaned back. He asked me if I had anyone staying with me. I said no. He asked if I'd ever had trouble with neighbors. I said no. He asked if I was on any medication. That one stung. I told him I was transgender, that I ran a channel online, that I lived alone, that someone had been under my bed. He nodded, took notes, then said they couldn't officially log the footage without evidence of forced entry or a visible crime. He suggested I check my locks and maybe stay with a friend. I walked out shaking, anger burning through the fear. That night I stayed at a hotel, barely slept, and returned the next morning with a friend to help me pack. We checked under the bed together. Nothing. No person, no blanket, no bag. Just dust and that same sock. I moved out a week later. I never got an explanation from the police. But I still have the footage. And sometimes, when I can't sleep, I watch it, just to remind myself that I wasn't imagining things. And that sometimes the scariest part isn't what's under the bed, but being told it doesn't count. I was halfway asleep when the sound started. A dry, dragging noise right under my back, like someone pulling a heavy coat across concrete. I snapped awake, heart already hammering, staring at the underside of the bunk above me, even though I was on the bottom rack, and there wasn't supposed to be anything beneath me at all. The sound stopped the moment I held my breath, and for a few seconds I told myself it was nothing, just the building settling or my imagination filling in gaps after too many long nights on duty. Then it happened again, slower this time, deliberate, moving from the foot of the bunk toward my head. I slid my hand out from under the blanket and pressed my palm flat against the mattress, feeling for vibration. The frame trembled faintly, enough that I knew the sound was real. I whispered my bunkmate's name, barely moving my lips, and when he didn't answer, I remembered he was on overnight vehicle watch. I was alone in the bay, surrounded by sleeping men who snored and muttered and shifted, none of them reacting to what was happening directly beneath me. I rolled onto my side and leaned over the edge, squinting into the narrow strip of darkness between the bed and the floor. There was no gap big enough for a person, no hatch, no crawl space. The bunk sat flush on the concrete. I'd helped move these things myself during inspection week. Still, something scraped underneath, close enough that I could feel the vibration in my ribs. I swung my legs off the bunk and stood up, boots hitting the floor harder than I meant to. The sound stopped immediately. I waited, listening, counting my breaths, feeling stupid and jumpy. After a minute of silence, I crouched and ran my fingers along the edge of the bed frame. Cold metal, dust, nothing else. No footprints, no loose bolts, no reason for the noise. I climbed back into bed, telling myself I was tired and stressed and letting my nerves get ahead of me. I closed my eyes and forced myself to relax. Maybe 10 minutes passed, maybe less. The scraping returned, closer now, right beneath my shoulders, followed by a faint rhythmic tapping, like knuckles testing the underside of the frame. I kicked the mattress and shouted, loud enough to wake the bay. A few guys groaned. Someone cursed. The noise vanished again. When the lights flicked on and heads lifted, I couldn't explain what I'd heard without sounding unhinged. I muttered something about a bad dream and lay back down, staring at the ceiling until morning. Over the next week it kept happening. Always late. Always when I was alone on the bottom bunk. Sometimes it sounded like crawling. Sometimes like something heavy being dragged in short bursts. Once, I felt a pressure push upward against the mattress, just enough to bow it slightly. And I rolled off the bed so fast, I bruised my shoulder on the locker. I reported it to my sergeant, choosing my words carefully. He listened, expression tight. Then told me the barracks was solid concrete, with no subfloor access, and suggested I get more rest. He reassigned me to a different bunk on the opposite side of the bay. The first night there was quiet, and I thought maybe that was the end of it. The second night, the sound came back. This time it wasn't directly under me. It moved. I heard it travel from my old bunk toward my new one, slow and patient, stopping beneath me like it knew where I was. I sat up, shaking, watching the floor as if something might push through it. The noise continued for nearly an hour, scraping, tapping, circling, until I was sure everyone else had to hear it too. No one stirred. The next morning I went back to my sergeant and refused to let it go. He didn't argue. He just stared at me for a long moment, then told me to report to maintenance after chow. The civilian foreman listened in silence as I described the sounds, then asked a question that made my stomach drop. Does it happen around the same time every night? I nodded. He told me to wait outside. When he came back, he said they'd do a full inspection after lights out. He didn't explain why, but the look on his face told me he already believed me. That night, I lay awake as a small group of men moved quietly through the bay, lifting mattresses, checking bolts, tapping the concrete with metal rods. When they reached my bunk, the foreman told me to get up. The sound started the moment I stepped away. It was louder than ever, frantic, scraping in fast bursts like something panicking. One of the maintenance guys swore and dropped to his knees, pressing his ear to the floor. Another grabbed a crowbar. They pried up a section of concrete I didn't know was removable, hidden beneath the bunk's metal base. Underneath was a shallow utility channel, barely high enough for a person to squeeze through. And inside it was a man. He was filthy, thin, eyes wild, pressed flat against the concrete like an animal caught in a trap. He screamed when the light hit him and tried to crawl deeper into the channel. But there was nowhere to go. They dragged him out kicking and crying, leaving streaks of blood and grime on the floor. Later, I learned the truth. He'd been a soldier too, years earlier, stationed there during winter training. He'd gone missing after a disciplinary incident. Officially, he'd deserted. In reality, he'd hidden in the maintenance channels to avoid punishment and lost track of time, then lost his mind. He survived on stolen food, moving only at night, sleeping under the bunks, listening to us breathe. He'd chosen my bed because I was quiet. They took him away. They sealed the channel. The sounds stopped. I finished my assignment and transferred out the next spring. I never slept on a bottom bunk again. I'm telling you this now because sometimes, even years later, I wake up feeling the mattress flex beneath me. Just a little, like something testing its weight. And in that moment before I'm fully awake, I can still hear the scraping, patient and familiar, moving closer in the dark. I was already halfway down the hall when the little girl called out to me, her voice sharp enough to stop my foot mid-step. She told me not to sit on the edge of the bed. Not ever. I turned around, confused, one hand still gripping the doorframe, and asked her why. She stared at me with that steady, unblinking seriousness kids sometimes get, and said it was because something underneath liked ankles. I laughed, because that is what you do when you are 19 and trying not to look nervous in someone else's house, and I told her monsters were not real. She shook her head and said she did not say monster. She said someone. I remember brushing it off as a game she played to scare babysitters. Her parents had already left, the front door closing with that final sound that tells you you are in charge now. I went back to the bedroom, helping her settle under the covers, tucking them tightly the way she insisted. She made me check under the bed with the bedside lamp, the yellow light barely reaching the back wall. Nothing was there except dust and a lost sock. She watched my face closely as I did it, like she was waiting for something else to appear. When I told her it was empty, she nodded but did not look relieved. She only reminded me again not to let my feet hang down when I sat. After she fell asleep, I went to the spare room they told me I could use. I dragged a chair closer to the bed so I could read while listening for her. The mattress was low, close to the floor, and when I sat, my heels brushed the carpet. I hesitated, then tucked my feet back underneath the chair without really thinking about why. I told myself I was being silly, letting a kid's imagination get to me. I opened my book, but I kept losing my place, distracted by how quiet the house felt, like it was holding its breath. A little after I settled in, I heard a soft sound from her room. Not a cry, not a call. More like a small movement. The scrape of fabric or skin against carpet. I went to her door and opened it slowly. She was asleep, face turned to the wall, breathing evenly. I stood there longer than necessary, listening. From that angle, I could see the dark space beneath her bed, a narrow shadowed strip. I felt a strange urge to look again, even though I already had. I told myself no and closed the door gently. Back in the spare room, I lay down instead of sitting. It felt safer somehow to have my whole body on the mattress. I kicked off my shoes and pulled the blanket up, making sure nothing dangled. I laughed quietly at myself, the sound too loud in the stillness. That was when I heard it again. This time it came from closer, right beneath me. A slow, deliberate dragging sound, like fingers being pulled across the carpet one by one. I froze, every muscle locking. My heart started pounding so hard it felt like it might lift me off the bed. I held my breath, listening. The sound stopped. I waited, counting my breaths in my head, telling myself it was the house settling, pipes shifting, anything normal. When nothing else happened, I exhaled shakily and forced myself to sit up. The space under the spare bed was darker than the one in the child's room, deeper. I leaned over the edge, holding the lamp low. Nothing, again, just empty floor and dust. I told myself I was tired, that my nerves were shot. I lay back down, turning onto my side, facing away from the edge. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was the sensation of pressure on my ankle. Fingers. Not grabbing, not yet, but resting there like someone testing weight. I screamed and jerked my leg up so fast I nearly fell off the bed. I scrambled backward until my back hit the wall, pulling both legs up to my chest. The lamp toppled and went out, plunging the room into darkness. I fumbled for the switch, hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. When the light came back on, I was alone. No hand, no movement. My ankle burned where it had been touched, the sensation lingering like a bruise forming. I ran to the child's room without thinking, needing another person, even a sleeping one. I shook her gently awake, my voice breaking as I asked if she had ever seen anyone under the bed. She looked at me sleepily and said, "She told me not to let my feet hang down. She said it always waited until adults forgot." I asked her what it was, my voice barely above a whisper. She shrugged and said it used to be her uncle. That snapped something in me. I demanded to know what she meant, but she rolled over, already drifting back to sleep, mumbling that he was not allowed upstairs anymore. I sat there on the floor, knees pulled in, staring at the bed skirt. I did not want to look, but I could not look away either. The house felt wrong now, like a place with rules I did not understand. I stayed there until morning, sitting on the chair with my feet tucked tight beneath me, every light in the house on. Nothing else happened. When her parents came back, I told them everything, expecting shock or concern. Instead, they exchanged a look that made my stomach drop. Her mother asked if I let my feet hang off the bed. I nodded, feeling stupid. She thanked me for staying and paid me extra, her hands shaking slightly as she did. I never went back. Years later, I heard through a friend that her uncle had lived with them briefly before he was arrested for hurting children. He used to hide under her bed to scare her into staying quiet at night. He died in prison. I do not know if what touched my ankle was memory, fear, or something else entirely. I only know that to this day, I never let my feet hang off the bed, no matter how tired I am, because some rules are learned once and never forgotten. I was already halfway under the bed when I realized the shoes didn't belong to the room. I had dropped to one knee, reached my arm beneath the frame to check for trash, like I always did, and my hand brushed against something leather and cold. I pulled back and stared. Two men's shoes, polished, toes aligned neatly, heels pressed flat against the wall. Not hotel slippers, not mine. My first thought was that the last guest had forgotten them, but that didn't make sense. The room had been checked out 3 days earlier, and I'd cleaned it myself. I lay flat on my stomach and looked properly this time. The shoes were only the beginning. A folded shirt, a belt coiled carefully, a small toiletry bag zipped shut. Everything arranged with intention, like someone had packed under the bed instead of into the closet. I felt my chest tighten, the way it does when your brain hasn't caught up with what your eyes are seeing. I backed out, stood up, and checked the room number again, even though I knew it by heart. I stood there listening to my own breathing, trying to reason it out. Sometimes guests hide things. Sometimes kids stash toys. But this was deliberate, clean, recent. I checked the bathroom, the closet behind the curtains. Empty. The room smelled the way it always did after turnover, neutral and faintly chemical. No sign anyone was staying here. No sign anyone should have been. I went back under the bed and pulled everything out, lining it up on the carpet. Wallet, phone charger, a folded receipt from the hotel bar with a date from 2 nights ago. My stomach dropped. 2 nights ago, the room had been vacant. At least, officially. I took the items down to reception and told the duty manager I'd found lost property. She frowned when she saw the receipt and pulled up the booking system. The guest assigned to that room had checked out 3 days earlier. Paid. Left a 5-star review. No complaints, no extensions. She asked me if I was sure about where I'd found the things. I told her exactly. Under the bed. She laughed once, uncomfortable, and said maybe housekeeping missed something. I told her I was the one who'd cleaned it. She stopped smiling then and called security. While we waited, she asked me to describe the items again. When I mentioned the wallet, she asked if I'd opened it. I said no. She asked me to. Inside was a driver license. Local. Queenstown. A man in his late 30s. The name matched the guest who'd checked out. Same face as the booking photo. Same address. Same everything. Security arrived and took the items. They asked me to show them the room. As we walked back, one of them joked that maybe the guy was hiding from his wife. I didn't laugh. I felt watched. Like the hallway was narrower than it had been earlier. When we got to the room, they asked me to wait outside while they checked. The door stayed open. I heard drawers opening, the mattress shifting. One of them said quietly that there was dust disturbance under the bed again, like someone had been reaching in and out. They told me to go home early. Said engineering would look at it in the morning. I tried to argue, but my voice came out thin and I didn't push it. I walked to the staff exit with my cart, feeling stupid for being shaken. All the way home, I kept thinking about how carefully the clothes were folded, about the receipt, about the fact that someone had been there recently enough to leave a paper trail. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept replaying the moment my hand touched the shoe, the certainty of it. In the morning, I checked my phone and saw a missed call from an unknown number around 3 in the morning. No voicemail. I told myself it was nothing. When I went back to work the next day, the room was marked out of service. Engineering had removed the bed. They said the frame had been tampered with. A panel underneath could be lifted from inside the room without tools. Old design flaw, apparently. I asked if they'd found anything else. One of the engineers looked at me for a long moment and said they'd found signs. Someone had been using the space beneath to hide belongings. Not sleep, just storage. Like a locker. Security pulled me aside later and asked more questions. Had I seen anyone enter the room after checkout? Had I heard anything unusual during my shifts? I said, no. I worked days. They exchanged a look that told me there was more they weren't saying. That afternoon, police came. Plain clothes. They took my statement in the break room. When I told them about the receipt dated 2 nights ago, one of them nodded and wrote something down slowly. They told me the guest hadn't gone home after checkout. His car was still in the hotel parking structure, parked on a level reserved for staff overnight. His keycard logs showed repeated access attempts to the room after checkout, all denied. But there were also door openings that didn't require a card, manual overrides, maintenance access times that didn't line up with any work orders. They asked me if I'd ever checked under beds at the end of my shift. I said no. We only did that during cleans. They asked me if I'd ever seen anyone else do it. I shook my head. One of them leaned forward and asked, very gently, if I was sure no one had been staying there. I said I was sure. 2 days later, they found the man. He was alive. That was the part that surprised everyone. He'd been living inside the hotel, moving between unused spaces, service corridors, and rooms marked vacant. He told them he didn't want to leave, that he felt safest there. That after checkout, he'd realized he could still access places if he was careful. Under beds were easiest. No cameras, no eyes. When they told me this, relief washed over me first. Then something colder followed. I asked where he'd been sleeping. The officer said he'd rotated. Never stayed in one place too long. But he admitted to using that room the most. Said it felt familiar. Said he liked knowing someone cleaned around him without knowing he was there. I quit a week later. Not because of fear exactly, but because every room started to feel occupied, even when it wasn't. I'd stand there with my cart, key card in hand, and hesitate, imagining someone holding their breath under the bed while I worked. I still think about how close I came to missing it, about how many times I'd been alone in a room with someone I didn't know was there. When I tell you this, I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to explain why I still check under my bed every night, even in my own home. I need to see empty space. I need to know no one's learned how to stay without being seen.